The New Testament is a Swindle, Part 2, by Humongous. A significant portion of the New Testament consists of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As suggested by many, the New Testament may have been written hundreds of years after Christ allegedly walked the earth. If such is the case, how could it be a first-hand account of anything Jesus allegedly did? In addition, how can one accurately remember what happened centuries ago? Most people can't recall what occurred in their own lives, no less, last week. Hence, we may have a version of the telephone game here. One generation apprises the next what they perceive happened, while the second generation imparts a skewed rendition of the supposed events to a third, the third to a fourth, and so on. After the passing of hundreds of years, you've got a completely different story than that of the original. Furthermore, Thomas Paine states, quote, "About 350 years after the time that Christ is said to have lived, several writings of the kind I am speaking of were scattered in the hands of diverse individuals, and as the church had begun to form itself into a hierarchy or church government with temporal powers, it set itself about collecting them into a code, as we now see them, called the New Testament. They decided by vote, as I have before said in the former part of the Age of Reason, which of those writings out of the collection they had made should be the Word of God, and which should not. The rabbins of the Jews had decided by vote upon the books of the Bible before. As the object of the church, as is the case in all national establishments of churches, was power and revenue, and terror the means it used, it is consistent to suppose that the most miraculous and wonderful of the writings they had collected stood the best chance of being voted." Unquote. As Thomas Paine declared, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who were allegedly living in close proximity to one another, couldn't agree on the same story, the New Testament was obviously not written by them, but by other individuals. When it comes to the New Testament, we're left with the Beatles producing an album on which George, John, Paul, and Ringo simultaneously croon contrasting lyrics to the same songs. The tome in question is jumbled chaos no one has been able to comprehend for well over 1,500 years. Over the course of more than a millennium, most folks believe the New Testament was composed by those for whom the individual books were named. Today, such a theory is highly questioned, not solely by those who denounce the Bible, but many theologians who study it. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't pen the books to which their names are attributed, who did? We're left with an anonymous publication. Should someone you'd never met before engage you on the street, bequeathing you an unsigned book he swore contained answers to everything, would you live your life by it? You'd be more likely to shove your own foot up your ass. Yet, that's exactly what 2.2 billion people are doing when they believe in the Bible. I don't know who the fuck wrote this thing, but goddamn, we gotta place all our faith in it, people. Says here in chapter 6, we need to dunk our balls in battery acid and knit our nipples to the rear of a Greyhound bus minutes before departure. Let's do this! Sounds stupid after being reduced to its basics, doesn't it? When exposing the falsehood of the New Testament, why not kick off with Jesus Christ, JC, leading cast member of the book? Christianity informs us JC was sent to earth to spread God's message to all nations. Unfortunately, Christ only spoke Hebrew. Since hundreds of languages were in use on earth at the time Jesus was allegedly here, and no printing press is present, how is disseminating this information possible? As Paine discloses, solely humans who at that time believed the world was flat and walkable in its entirety would assume such could be accomplished. An omniscient deity would know better. Quote, But how was Jesus Christ to make anything known to all nations? He could speak but one language, which was Hebrew. And there are in the world several hundred languages. Scarcely any two nations speak the same language or understand each other. And as to translations, every man who knows anything of languages knows that it is impossible to translate from one language into another, not only without losing a great part of the original, but frequently of mistaking the sense. And besides all this, the art of printing was wholly unknown at the time Christ lived." Unquote. Also, don't you think the Son of God would be able to speak any and all languages he wanted? After all, the dude purportedly rose from the dead, didn't he? In addition, if it had been Jesus' objective to create a new religion, why didn't he write the dogma upon which it was based himself, or have it written by others while he was living? The Bible is the playbook manual for Christianity. As such, why not compose it while the quarterback is still alive? Leaving it to chance that someone else may pick up the ball at a later date seems risky. Let's begin with Matthew 2:16. In this verse, Herod, ruler of the Jews and a real party guy, ordered the execution of all boys in and around Bethlehem, quote, 2 years old and under, unquote. What's life without a hobby? Only Matthew writes about this. John, Luke, and Mark don't even mention it. You'd think such a drastic and heinous act would be reported by all 4 of these alleged authors. If you're a news outlet only covering the consistency of Zac Efron's stool when the UN demands all males under 2 must die, do you think you'll be viewed as a credible information source? Mark testifies Christ was crucified at 9 a.m., while John asserts it was noon. Juan, sleeping off a hangover. How about what was written over Christ when he was crucified? We're talking one sentence of inscription here. As John states, it was, quote, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, unquote. Luke recalls it being, quote, this is the King of the Jews, unquote. Mark, quote, the King of the Jews, unquote. For Matthew, we're looking at, quote, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews, unquote. Guys, this is a single sentence. Y'all couldn't even agree on that? We're referring to your main man, walking on water, bringing people back from the dead, etc. Don't you think you would have remembered exactly what it said on the written notice above his cross? Matthew purports Mary Magdalene and the other Mary arrived around dawn to check out Christ's grave. John alleges it was dark and Mary came alone. Luke insists Mary Magdalene, Joanna, James' mom Mary, and a mess of other women made the trek. We claim it wasn't anybody, since this is obviously some really boring yet twisted fairy tale. Matthew rambles on about a massive earthquake prior to the angel of the Lord cruising down from heaven, rolling back the boulder covering Christ's crypt, and sitting on it. The other books don't mention said tremor, nor the angel hanging out on the huge rock. Luke endorses the two-angel theory, arguing both were standing up. Oh, Luke, why such a rebel? Why? Mark attests, how come we're even having to write about this crap? Aren't errant asteroids we should be doing our best to stop headed our way? Anyway, Mark purports one angel spoke to Mary. Luke swears it was 2. And John says Jesus was chatty Cathy. At this point, Payne brings up the fact that if these 4 stooges were in court providing testimony, we'd be looking at perjury charges by now. This thing's more of a mockery than the OJ trial. Perceptive catch here, whomever wrote the book of Matthew tells a tale that doesn't appear in any of the other books. According to Matt, guards at Christ's grave told a handful of priests about some strange shit happening in the cemetery. As such, these quote-unquote holy guys paid off the sentries to lie that Jesus' apostles had engaged in a little grave robbing. Sure sounds easier to digest than divulging that JC had risen from the dead and might be preparing to kick ass. In addition, Matt fucked up, once again, by exclaiming, quote, "So they took the money and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day," unquote. That last term, quote, "until this day," could be further proof whomever wrote the Gospel of Matthew was not Matthew himself, but someone else long after these events purportedly occurred. Until this day designates a lengthy passage of time. The author of Matt's book has 11 of Christ's followers headed to Galilee to meet Jesus in a mountain. John, however, proclaims these adherents were somewhere else at that time. And of course, Mark doesn't even mention the party caravan to G-Town. Thomas Paine brings up another great point. All four alleged authors of these Gospels finally agree on something, that Christ's resurrection was a private affair. Thus, very few witnesses. Hence, not many to interview, with the possibility of finding flaws in the story. In addition, only Paul, where the fuck did he come from, asserts 500 folks saw Christ alive post-mortem. Did any of those 1,000 make the claim themselves? Nope. You've got to admit, the whole suffering and dying for our sins thing, even though you're not only God's child, but God himself, is as convoluted and ridiculous as Obamacare. It makes no fucking sense. What point are you, being a supreme deity, attempting to prove? Furthermore, why go about it in such circuitous fashion that causes billions of people to agonize and die unnecessarily? Then again, that's the point, isn't it? The Bible is that 6-inch thick sheaf of legalese you receive from the IRS that wouldn't make sense if you did take 14 years to read it. This piece of literary shit, by far the most purchased book in written history, is a sleight of hand, dumped in our laps so we'll ponder it, whilst failing to notice the overwhelming atrocities perpetrated on us every day. As Thomas Paine writes, quote, "The fall of man, the account of Jesus Christ being the Son of God, and of his dying to appease the wrath of God, and of salvation by that strange means, are all fabulous inventions, dishonorable to the wisdom and power of the Almighty," unquote. In the end, Paine exclaimed, quote, "Of all the systems of religion that were ever invented, there is none more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, and more contradictory to itself than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, and too inconsistent for practice, it renders the heart torpid, or produces only atheists and fanatics. As an engine of power, it serves the purpose of despotism, and as a means of wealth, the avarice of priests. But so far as respects the good of man in general, it leads to nothing here or hereafter. The Christian theory is little else than the idolatry of the ancient mythologists, accommodated to the purposes of power and revenue," unquote. In the words of Billy Connolly, quote, "I find it, Catholicism, primitive and frightening. I find the whole child molestation on an international scale a disgrace. I have a deep distrust and dislike of the Catholic Church and any other organization that brainwashes people. There was Sarah Palin, wanted to be Vice President of America, which would make her the second most powerful person in the world. And if McCain unfortunately died, she would be the most powerful person in the world. This is a person who thinks the world is 4,000 years old. Unquote.